you, how many of you have worked with clay? Most of us did as kids. How many of you have really worked with clay? Like maybe even in an artsy sort of way? Any of you? Nice, nice. Several years ago, in fact it's been almost 9, I was preaching on this same passage and I had access to a potter's wheel. Now, some of you know I was looking for one for today, and I thought that I could figure it out. And so I got my clay, just like I had up there, and I got it wet, and I practiced a little bit, and I plopped it on the wheel, because I watched Ghost, and you know they do it in Ghost. And I plopped it on the wheel, and it was one of those foot ones, so I didn't have to worry about it going too fast. And I could speed it up or slow it down, and I was working on it, and folks, it was going everywhere. And it was not making the shape that I wanted. And I thought, well, I'll practice a little bit more. So I practiced a little bit more, and I was very unsuccessful. And I finally got to the point where I did make a pot, just like the one I told the kids about, where I just simply made one of those things, you know, make a lot of snakes, and you wrap it around, and pretty soon you can have your coil basket. And that's what I made. But prior to that, I was tempted to just quit and make an ashtray, but I realized I didn't know anybody that smoked, so I didn't do that. So when you're thinking about clay, when you're thinking about how difficult it is, I want you to now remember that Jeremiah lived in a time where all of their things were made out of clay. And so they didn't do a lot of firing, they did do some hardening, but things broke all the time. And so they would go down to the potter's house pretty frequently. And at the potter's house, he had this sense of thriftiness. And so because the things had not been fired often, he could take those shards and get them wet and remake something. And that's what Jeremiah saw as he went down to the potter's house. He saw an analogy that this potter was doing the same thing with those clay shards and pieces as God does with each and every one of us. As you think about that, we think sometimes that we are formed and we're ready to go, but you saw those kids, they were different heights than they're going to be in 2 years. They were different shapes than they're going to be in 2 years. And we were all different shapes than we were 10 years ago, right? Yeah, we know how that works. Yeah. We are constantly being formed and shaped by our environment, physically as well as mentally and emotionally. Those people who have had a wonderful life find themselves able to go on and be a lot more successful sometimes. Or maybe not. Maybe because they've been given too many things, they are always waiting for somebody to give them that next thing, and they are not successful. And maybe it's someone who's had hard scrabble life. They've gone through troubles and trials, and they've come out on the other side. We are always being shaped and formed by the events and the people in our lives. And so Jeremiah reminds the people of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 2, we see that God formed human beings out of the dust of the earth. And then out of that lump of clay there was no life, and so God breathed into the nostrils of that lump of clay free will and creativity, because we were created in the image of God. Jeremiah was reminding folks about the pottery connection, about the dirt connection, as Isaac told us. Too often, we think, again, that we are formed. But folks, the only time that we are completely formed and completely set is when we are dead. Because at that point, we are no longer growing in life. We are only decomposing back into that which God created us from. We were born as human beings in the image of God. We have great adaptability, and that is what has allowed us to continue to do so much. But Jeremiah saw in Israel and the people of Israel, people who had begun to be pulled in the wrong direction. They were on the wrong track. They were acting in ways that were evil and unjust. They were oppressing the poor and forgetting God's commandments. They were flawed pots, like that one that I kept trying to work on that wheel. It just went everywhere. You know that if you ever tried to work on a wheel, even when you sort of get that thing centered, if your hands are just a bit off, you get one side higher than the other, and then when you try to correct it, you get the other side higher, and pretty soon the walls are too thin and it begins to fall in on itself. And that's what was happening to Israel. But we also know, because Jeremiah reminds us, that in the hands of an experienced potter, an ordinary lump of clay, like the ones that the kids are working with right now, can become glorious pieces of art. They can become wonderful, useful pieces. Too often, however, we speak as if we were those folks of Israel. And we use those words that we heard in verse 12. It's no use. We will continue with our own plans. Let me add to that. It's no use. Change isn't possible for me. I've already been to therapy and it didn't help. It's no use. I tried every diet and it didn't work. It's no use. The problems of the world are too big. What can I do? It's no use. Other people may be able to change, but not me. I'm a special case. I can screw anything up. Sometimes that sounds familiar because those are the words that we speak. But folks, when we say those words, we are negating God's power, God's mercy, and God's love. Hopelessness is an easily learned behavior because we do get affirmation for it. People feel sorry for us. We get the attention that we need. And I think that for every person that says you can do it, there are probably 5 that say, oh, go ahead and give up. It's just too hard. Come join me on the couch and we'll sit here and use our remote and eat our Doritos. We can't do anything anyway. Too often we are armed with cynicism. We are armed with that channel changer. We are armed with our bag of Doritos. And we don't try to allow God to change us. We are hopeless, flawed pots. We are uncentered. So, in this passage, we hear some wonderful news. That even then, even when we find ourselves on the couch with our Doritos and our channel changer, even then, God comes to us. God is with us. God will continue to try to shape us and guide us. God will add a little of that living water, and God will help us be recreated into the image that we were supposed to be in the first place. That's Jeremiah's understanding of God and the world, that God does remain with us, that God does recreate us and rework us, both individually and as a community. We are not left, thanks be to God, to our own devices. God does continue to fashion us as individuals, free to follow God's call, free to adhere to God's gentle yet firm guidance. And Jeremiah knew that the people of his day could change as well, because they were in the hands of the master potter. They could become less selfish. They could turn away from greed. They could turn away from war and prejudice. He knew that in God's hands, all of us can overcome addictions. We can overcome apathy. And we can certainly overcome anxiety. Now, Jeremiah, as so many of the prophets of his day, was very stern. He did that finger shaking. And quite blunt. You can imagine why he got himself in trouble. But he was saying some things that were important, even if they were hard to hear, because he believed strongly in the possibility of repentance and change. And his message was that God is not done with us. Not now, not ever. So, if you are one of those people that wants to change, Jeremiah's words are probably refreshing to you. However, if you are comfortable sitting on your couch with your remote and your Doritos, then you may not like to hear those words that God is not finished with us yet. In fact, if we are in business, we have to be honest, some of us benefit from things that we should not be benefiting from. And in those cases, we might not want to change. But I want you to hear something that Dante wrote. He said, hell is a truth seen too late. Jeremiah makes it clear that the nation of Israel and all of us who come afterward are like clay in the hands of the master potter. And because of that, hope begins with the realization that we were created in God's image and we were pronounced very good. If you trust that God created your inmost being and knit you together in your mother's womb, as it says in Psalm 139, then you know you are made of the right stuff. And you can set your path once again towards abundant life. There is no place that you can go, no situation that you can encounter where God is not. We are clay that God has fashioned in the divine image. Clay that has been bestowed with the ability to reveal God through our words and through our actions of love and grace and compassion and justice. But we are also formed with free will. And so therefore we have the choice to not follow that path and instead to conceal God through the opposites of all of those fine qualities. We are free to choose. Free to choose whether we will allow ourselves to be shaped in ways that are for the good, or whether we will allow ourselves to be misshapen, pulled and stretched in ways that take us away from the image of God. If we follow our own paths, there will continue to be devastating consequences. Because when love, grace, compassion, and justice go unimaged, in other words, we were in the image of God, unimaged in our day, we get instead things like the Holocaust, Abu Ghraib, Sandy Hook Elementary, Emmett Till, the World Trade Center, and so many more that you could name. They become synonyms for our capability to choose a path other than the good. And each of us, though somewhat ordinary lumps of clay, can be transformed into glorious and amazing vessels, shaped in the hands of the master potter, and reshaped again, because God doesn't quit on us. God tries and tries again. So what kind of vessel are you? You have many choices up here. Are you a pitcher to water the gardens of our neighborhoods? Some of you are. Or maybe to share cool water on a hot afternoon. Are you a bowl brimming over with the fruit of the Spirit? Or are you a perfume vial filled with healing oil? Are you a basin to wash feet and hands in? Or a fine goblet that is fashioned for a king's table? Or are you a large platter, maybe even one with a crack down the middle, that will hold the bread and the meat of God's word? Each one of us is uniquely created by the potter. And God alone knows our color, our shape, and our purpose. Will you allow the gentle hands of God to transform your heart, to reform your heart, to recreate you into a beautiful piece of art inside our very ordinary looking lumps